Welcome, listeners, to the first ever podcast of Irish Border Poll, Irish Border Poll Conversations. My name's Kevin Rooney, editor of the site, and with me is Kevin Maher, regular contributor to Irish Border Poll, well-known United Irelander and author. The reason for our podcast is very simple. We want to talk everything Border Poll and everything United Ireland. And our podcast, we hope to come out on a relatively regular basis. And if God spares us, we hope to be cracking away at these podcasts for 6 or 7 years until about 2030, 2031, which we hope by that time a border poll will come and the result will be a happy story. Now, without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to make history by inviting our first ever guest, which is the one and only former leader of the Alliance Party, John Alderdice, otherwise known as Lord Alderdice. And Lord Alderdice was the first Speaker of the Stormont Assembly and now sits in the House of Lords and former leader of the party. So without further ado, listeners, I'm going to pass you on to Kevin Maher, who will basically kick off, give you a sense of the structure of the conversation and introduce the first question or two to Lord Alderdice. So take it away, Kevin.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. John, a lot of people will instinctively know who you are. You've been present in my sort of political memory for a very, very long time. Not only because, of course, you sport a superb beard as well, which you have done for a very long time. Give us a sense of who you are. Where are you from? Who are your people? Where did you grow up? Where do you start from?
Well, my parents, David and Helena Alderdice. David, my dad, came from South Armagh, from a little place called Mullaglass, which is between Bessbrook and Newry. And my mum's background was the Shields family in the Mournes. So down in that southern area, kind of near enough to the border. And both came from Protestant backgrounds. My father was a Presbyterian minister, so I grew up in that kind of context. But one of the things that was very striking and perhaps a bit different from quite a lot of other Presbyterian ministers' families was my father was very comfortable with South Armagh. Indeed, when he came to retire, he retired to the Glens of Antrim because, again, it was a mixed area with a deep history and culture. And he found it very interesting to talk about the political dimension of things. He himself was of the view that ultimately, but ultimately might be a long way away, ultimately Ireland would be reunited. And that wasn't something that he had any kind of difficulty or problem about. But of course, that wasn't the case for the congregations to whom he ministered. Most of them would be from quite a Unionist background. In fact, the last main congregation that he pastored was in Ballymena, where he knew Ian Paisley's father very well because he was a pastor of a little church in the town, and indeed knew Ian himself quite well. So the background I came from was, in a sense, a little bit different from usual because it was a strong Protestant background, but an openness, both politically and culturally, to other influences within the island of Ireland and much beyond. And the faith dimension was very important, but it wasn't a faith dimension that was exclusive or excluding of people who were coming from, particularly from different Christian backgrounds, but even beyond that. So that's the kind of background I came from. But the thing that really disturbed me, I suppose, was the fact that as I was growing up, things were breaking down into violence again. And I found that very troubling. And I found it difficult to understand in a way, because a lot of the people that I would meet were perfectly decent people who left to themselves. And indeed, if you met them some other part of the world, you'd get on very well with them. But something happened to people in the context of Northern Ireland that produced a very different and tragic outcome. And I wanted to understand, why did people behave in this kind of way rather than just find ways of getting on together?
I mean, you're of that kind of, classically of that kind of age where you will have been a young man at the start of the Troubles, and you're there as a medical student, so you're somebody that is, I suppose in those kind of late teens, early 20s years, somebody with a very clear idea of where they're going and perhaps what their future career might be. But just cast your mind back. I mean, what were your thoughts at that time? The kind of formative years, late teens, early 20s, when often dramatic events are going on around you. What were your, what was your perception of things at that time, and did you have any formative political experiences?
It's a funny kind of thing whenever you get violence in a community, in your own community, at that sort of age and stage. And you're right, it's very formative because you have very mixed feelings. I mean, I remember at that time, there were all the civil rights marches, and then there were the counter demonstrations against them and so on. Every Saturday, in fact, there would be one of these, and then increasingly they broke down into pretty nasty violence. And there would be, on the one hand, there would be a certain sort of excitement almost, what's going to happen and what is it that's going on. And, you're young, you're in your early teens, you don't really realize the significance of all of this. And there's almost a certain buzz. And then there's another part of you that says, this is not good, and it's not going to be good, and people are getting hurt, and people then are getting killed. And, what do we do about this? How do we understand this? And I started to read quite a lot of political science at the time. In fact, I was at Ballymena Academy, which was a state school, but very largely Protestant pupils, because any of the Catholic pupils were going to St. Louis Convent School. But one of the friends that I had, who was a very good friend, was a young Catholic girl called Patricia. And we would talk a lot about politics and discuss it and so on. And I read quite a lot of political science, and I got a bit frustrated with it because the political science arguments at the time were that people acted in their own rational self-interest, socially and economically and so on. And it didn't seem to me that people were acting in their own best interests at all. Nobody was benefiting out of all of this, and it was going on, and of course it went on a very great deal longer than that. But what it made me do was to try to think, well, what can I do to do something helpful? Initially, because my father's church, we had lots of missionaries would come from various parts of the world, and I thought I would go into medicine because that would be helpful if I went out to the mission field. I could be a medical doctor in the mission field. And then after a while, I began to think, what on earth am I going out there for when there's so much trouble here? And so I began to think what would be helpful. And I thought, well, if I went into psychiatry, I might be able to learn why people behave in destructive, self-destructive, damaging ways, non-rational ways. And maybe if I could understand that, I could understand why whole communities of people behave in self-destructive and self-damaging ways. So that's what I did. I went into medicine and psychiatry and in psychoanalysis. And then I began to think, how do I apply that in politics? And I actually wrote to 4 out of the 5 main parties. I didn't write to Sinn Féin because I wasn't at all happy about the IRA campaign. But I wrote to the Alliance Party, the SDLP, the Ulster Unionists, the DUP. I got back a lot of stuff from the DUP and Ulster Unionists, which was all red, white and blue. I got some interesting stuff back from the SDLP. And I got stuff back from the Alliance Party, which really appealed to me. And a guy came round, a guy with a beard, as it happens, came round to talk with me. And I felt very warm to that. First of all, because I think in political terms, I'm a fairly classic liberal. I like the idea of human rights and tolerance and pluralism and so on. And later, because at that time the environment wasn't such a big thing, but later the environmental questions. But also the idea that it was the Alliance Party. It was quite, even in its name, it was reaching out to people from both traditions and both sections of the community. And I thought, well, that's a good place to be if what you're trying to do is end the violence and get some kind of agreement across the very deep historic and religious and cultural differences. And so I got involved in the Alliance Party. And that soaked up a lot of my interests and energies then over the next number of years.
So, I mean, Alliance is formed in 1970. I mean, is this the kind of time period that you're talking about?
No, it was later. I was still a boy at school in 1970. So this would have been more like 77, 78, that sort of time. And of course, there were a lot of things going on at that time as well, because people were coming out on the streets, the peace people, peace women initially, and then peace people. And Alliance was initially doing quite well at that stage because people were still hopeful that that kind of politics could bring some kind of resolution of things. Of course, a couple of years later, we had Margaret Thatcher elected with the European elections and Ian Paisley topping the poll. And it all started to change then. And then the first election I stood in for the Alliance Party was in the hunger strike, which was not a very good time for the Alliance Party. I remember going to to one village, and just on the outside of the village, guy stopped me and said, "What are you coming here for?" I said, "Well, I'm standing for the Alliance Party." He said, "There's no votes for you here, son. Away on home." And he was right. There weren't any votes for me in that village. But it didn't stop me in the sense that I stood for election and I continued on in politics, and quite quickly got increasingly involved in it. I still was a medical student at that time, but I continued on and qualified in medicine and continued in psychiatry and tried to apply psychological understandings to the problems of politics.
Just one final one from me, and I'll pass over to Kevin. I suppose given your background and given the context of the times, why Alliance and not the kind of liberal wing of the UUP? Was that ever an appeal for you, or were you always a classic liberal, as you're saying, and actually, that being in a Unionist party would have been not where you instinctively would have placed yourself?
Yeah, you're quite right. It wasn't. I remember my grandmother on my mother's side, and she said, "Well, it's all very nice that John's got in politics, but it's a pity it's not in the Ulster Unionist Party." And I thought to myself at the time, she really doesn't understand me terribly well. There wasn't any way that I was going to be in the Ulster Unionist Party. That wasn't where I was coming from. It wasn't actually where my father was coming from at all either. But it wasn't where I was coming from. To me, it represented a particular, well, there were a whole lot of things about it. And as I say, I was instinctively a liberal for whom the question wasn't, are you a British nationalist or an Irish nationalist? The question was, what's the best thing for the people of the community that I'm living in? How can we live together with our differences? How can we disagree without killing each other? That was the issue for me at the time, and for many years thereafter as well. And there were some people. The person I would have been closest to in political terms, in the way I looked at things, would not have been the Ulster Unionist leaders of the time, but probably would have been John Hume. I mean, there were a lot of things, particularly in the way that John spoke about things in the early times. There were a lot. I mean, I would have agreed a great deal with him, but there was an interesting time. When the Alliance Party was being founded, he was invited by Jim Hendren, Joe's brother, to join the Alliance Party. But John had decided no, he wanted to form a party which is a Social Democratic Party, but also a party that was more clearly a nationalist party. He wasn't a hardline nationalist, but that was what he was wanting and looking towards. For me, that wasn't the key issue. But in a lot of other ways, I mean, all his talk about relationships between communities and all of that kind of thing was very much, and being pro-European was very much part of my politics as well. So I always found that I would easily listen to what John was saying, even if I wouldn't necessarily sign up for exactly where he got to in the Irish context.
John, that's brilliant. I think I'll kick in and go straight to that blog that you wrote a few months ago. So the way that I see it is you were quite quiet. I hadn't heard from you for a while. I'm sure you were doing your stuff. But then you wrote that blog and everybody picked up on it, north and south in the media. And you said a number of things. So let me pick out the first thing that sort of jumped out at me. We were talking about the election, the local election, when pro-Irish Unity candidates basically pulled more votes than pro-Union. And you said that it would probably most likely prove to be the most consequential election in the history of the North. So could you just elaborate on that a wee bit? I mean, you alluded to it, but I didn't think you said it in explicit terms. Do you consider that effectively a tipping point in the constitutional question?
I think it was a very important marker. And it was an important marker in a number of different ways. I mean, from a Unionist point of view, of course, it was deeply troubling because any Unionist that really seriously thought about it, and of course not all did, but any that seriously thought about it realized, wait a minute, that the numbers game has changed, is changing, and is going to change more. For people from a nationalist background who were looking towards the possibility of a united Ireland, one would have sensed there must have been a profound sense of encouragement that actually things were, history was going in their direction. And there was another element to it, I think, which was something like this. for me, I held to somewhat to a view that Garret Fitzgerald expressed near the end of his life. He wrote a column in the Irish Times, and what he was basically saying in this is that the IRA violence had turned off a lot of people, north and south, and had actually pushed the agenda further away from a united Ireland. And what I took from that election result was that we were beginning to get beyond the consequences of the trouble and violence, that people could begin to look beyond that. Now, not everybody could, particularly people who themselves were victims, or there were people in their family circle on all sides. You couldn't just walk away from that, forget about it, and so on. So, but there was a whole new generation of people, and that was changing things. I mean, when I was Alliance leader, there was the first generation of people. There were a lot of enthusiasts as well, but because of the trouble, a lot of those people were saying to their kids, "Look, this is going to go on forever here. It'd be far better to go to England and Scotland and stuff like that." And so, as a political leader, one of the benefits I did not have was the next generation of founder members, their kids and so on, weren't coming into the party, not because they had lost faith in it, but because they'd gone to live somewhere else. And then the double whammy was, when they then were settled in England and Scotland and whatever, and started having children, their parents, who had become grandparents and who were the founding generation, they upped sticks to go to be with the grandchildren. And so not only did you lose the second generation, you started losing the first generation as well. And so it took really quite a while for things to progress and a new generation to begin to arise, for whom people like me were old fellas, who were very interesting as far as history was concerned, and even after a while didn't remember the history at all. But there was a whole new generation of young people arising for whom these kinds of issues really were not important. Their issue was not about being in the United Kingdom or United Ireland. It was about being in a united Europe.
Yeah.
And they began to see things in a very different kind of way. And of course, one of the other things that was important, 100 years or more ago, people in the North, if they looked beyond all the kind of sectarian divisions and cultural and religious divisions, if they just looked at their economic welfare, it was a fairly industrial society, and it had access to the British Empire, the biggest empire the world had ever seen, a huge market for heavy engineering and so on. But that had all disappeared 100 years later, and actually the big market they needed access to was the European Union. The access to Britain was important because it was close by, it was on the doorstep, but the European Union had all sorts of other possibilities in it. And being an English-speaking part of the European Union was very attractive to our American cousins to work. So there were things happening. They weren't happening suddenly. They were happening generationally and developing. And the other thing, which I'm not sure whether I said it in that blog or whether I said it later, but I was over here. I've been here about 27 years or something like that, and I've seen a change in attitudes. For a long time, a lot of ordinary people have not been interested in Northern Ireland. It's just a nuisance. But leaders, people in Westminster, people, for example, who had fought in the war along with people from Northern Ireland and so on. Those people had grown old, had retired, had died, and a new generation was arising that had no memory of all of that sort of stuff at all, and therefore no emotional attachment to Northern Ireland. They weren't angry about it. They were just, well, it didn't really matter terribly much. That wasn't where their focus was. And their concern about keeping the United Kingdom together was keeping Scotland in. It wasn't about keeping Northern Ireland in anymore. And I thought, you're quite right. I hadn't said an awful lot publicly for a while, but I just felt, look, you need to understand there's something really important happening here. You really need to pay attention to it, because it has all sorts of consequences. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about those consequences. But that's why I came back to saying things. And to be honest, I was a bit surprised about how much it got picked up. But it did make me feel that I'd touched on something that was worth having further conversations about, because things get picked up when the time is right. If you say something and it's not the right time, nobody pays any attention. But if you hit on by perchance or whatever, you hit on something that is really important for people, then they're interested, they pick it up.
Yeah, no, John, I agree. And I think you caught the zeitgeist with that for sure. And I was going to ask you about it, but you've already touched on it, about that point that you made about you had that feeling that the English were mostly detached from the north of Ireland. And so I won't go back in that. But I do want to ask you, a sub question about something you said about the new generation, and they don't have the baggage, and you were talking about Gareth Fitzgerald stuff and so on and so forth. And in a way, I suppose some of the stuff that came out of the Alliance Party at the weekend with John Tong's analysis of the young membership being increasingly United Islander. I want to ask you a question, because I look at you and I think there's life in the old dog yet. So let's forget about young people and let's talk about the slightly older people like ourselves. When you're looking at the situation now and the membership of the European Union and the vibrant economy in the South and so on and so forth, I mean, you know, to be frank, I'm asking you a very straight question here. What do you think yourself? I mean, do you think, well, you know, I think the prospect of Irish unity, you know, it's quite attractive at the moment compared to the past where it was a no-go because of the IRA and other stuff that happened, and perhaps the economic state of the South and so on and so forth, and UK being out of the EU?
I think we're in a period of enormous change in Ireland. It's been going on for quite a while, in fairness, and it's some of the things that you've described. You know, you now have an economy in the South which is a prosperous economy. It's doing very well indeed. You also have a huge change in social attitudes and in religious attitudes, and that would have been a big thing when I was growing up. You know, the whole mother and baby and all of this kind of stuff that was going on. And now that's just evaporated, basically. It's got completely different. And indeed, I think it's recognized by people, even from a fairly robustly Protestant background. There was an interview with Eileen Paisley, Ian's widow, some time ago, and she was asked, well, what would happen if people voted for United Ireland? And she said, well, this is my country. I wouldn't be leaving it as long as I wasn't persecuted. You know, she said, things have changed. You know, my Ian was in government with Martin McGuinness, and they got on very well together. And so, you know, you get a sense that, no, she's not going to vote for United Ireland, but there's not the same kind of either fear or hostility.
Yes.
There's a degree of openness. Now, these things don't change rapidly. Yes. Usually, I mean, sometimes they do, but usually they take time to develop. And there are all sorts of other elements to it. There's the ones you've mentioned, but I mentioned another one. I was talking a little while ago to John, actually before I came over this side of the water, so it must be pre-COVID. And I was talking to this woman who I knew had voted SDLP all her life. And I said to her with a sort of smile on my face, well, you're going to get what you want. She said, what are you talking about? I said, well, it was going to be United Ireland. And she said, oh, but I don't want that. I said, well, but late. I said, you've been voting for it all your life. I said, well, why are you saying you don't want it? She said, I don't want to lose the NHS. Mm-hmm. The NHS is really important to me. And you know, I think things would be different in the South. The thing is, since that conversation just pre-COVID, the whole business of the NHS has changed absolutely radically. I was doing a thing earlier on this evening with some colleagues who are in psychiatry and so on. And I was saying to them, I can't see how the NHS can continue in anything like its current form. It's not a question of more money. The system doesn't work any longer. And I think this is something Sinn Féin actually have to be quite careful about, because they know that the NHS has a historic attraction for people. And so they've been talking about how the system in the South needs to change to be more like the NHS. Well, you know, actually, if healthcare is to survive in the North, I actually think it may have to become more like the health system in the South, because I think it has to be more contributory if realistically the thing's going to survive. I mean, in the North, it's all very well to say free at the point of delivery, but if the delivery means you've got to wait 5 years for a health service appointment, that's not a service at all. And people are going to start paying for it and so on anyway. You'd be better to have a system that helped people and assisted people to find the kind of healthcare they need. So I think Sinn Féin needs to be careful. I think it needs to work out what is the offer. You know, say, are you going to vote for United Ireland? Say, well, what exactly are you talking about United Ireland? But when it comes, for example, to healthcare, which I think is really important to people, and maybe even a swing vote thing for some people, they may need to be careful to not offer something that's no longer deliverable. Because I think that's the case with the health service. So I think we're in a period of change. If you were to ask me, if I was simply asked today, on the information I have, living in Northern Ireland, what would I do? Well, I think I would vote for the situation as it is at the moment, but with an openness to it changing. But I would also, in myself, have a caveat that said it is changing. It may even change quickly, and that's not predictable. We didn't predict Brexit. You know, we thought probably people wouldn't quite go that far. We didn't know that There was something rising, but we didn't think people would go quite that far. But when it happened, it has had a huge impact, including on the question that we're talking about. So major impact on that. So there are external factors that sometimes arise that either speed things up or slow things down.
Yes.
And then there are the things that you can have an impact on yourself. So, for example, Sinn Féin could do some things or say some things that would make people pull back, or they could do and say some things that would make people say, oh, I didn't think that was possible. Oh, that's interesting. You know, I think whenever last year, at the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, you know, the Sinn Féin leader said, well, you know, I don't want to stop people being British. And if there's United Ireland, they should still be able to have British passports. And people go, oh, wow. No, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that intervention from Mary Lou was a very thoughtful one, a very interesting one, and potentially quite an important one. I'm sure it'll shake the British government up a little bit, but how are they going to react to the question of giving passports to people that don't actually live within the UK? That's going to be their problem. But I thought Mary Lou's intervention was a very interesting one.
Kevin, I'm going to just squeeze one last sub question to John, mate, and then it's over to you. So when I listen to you, John, this is what I get. I get someone who was effectively, you know, a moderate unionist in the Alliance Party. It was where it was, and things have moved. You've talked about the European Union. You've talked about the last election. I think you talked in our Irish Border Poll meeting at Westminster last week about the trajectory that we seem to be on. And at points in your answer there, you're almost giving advice to Sinn Féin, as well as warnings to United Irelanders about the best way to play it. So that's all dead on. And, you know, there's pluses and minuses. Your advice about the NHS is extremely well made, by the way, extremely well made about the problems of the NHS in the north. But then you're talking about EU membership as a real positive. So are you now, would I be right in thinking that what's happened to yourself, you're looking at the change in context, you are effectively middle-of-the-road person, but for the union, you've moved to a degree and you're listening to the conversation and you're open-minded about the direction of travel?
Yes, I think that is absolutely right. But I think here language is really very important. You know, someone like me was never keen to be called a unionist, because for me, a unionist was somebody who was wanting and prepared to defend the union kind of come what may. I mean, I don't mean blindly, but that was the fundamental thing. And all the other stuff was sort of secondary stuff. Or on the other hand, an Irish nationalist who would have said, don't talk to me about whether we're better off or not. That's not the key thing for me. I want to have a United Ireland that's independent for all these kinds of reasons. And I wouldn't have subscribed to either of those. My position would have been, well, what's the best thing for our people? Yes. Our people as a whole, our community. And that includes things like being able to live together with our differences, includes social and economic questions, it includes relationships with people outside of these islands, all of that kind of stuff, and how we deal with the history, with all its pluses and minuses. So the language for me is important. I would never have wanted, and I often would, when I was Alliance leader, would correct people who say the Alliance Party is a unionist party. I say, it's not a unionist party. It may at this point be pro-union because of the context, but it's not opposed to that situation changing if it appears that that's in the best interests of the people. And a lot of folk find that very difficult because there was this incessant binary split, you know. Which kind of nationalist are you? Really?
Yes, yes.
No, I'm not one of those. That's not the issue for me.
John,
a lot of people find that hard to get a hold of.
Brilliant stuff and fascinating. I get you. I find it really, really fascinating. Kevin, I'm hogging up the questions, so I'll pass over to you.
Just one last question, John, really, on the things that you were mentioning last year. I mean, you were quoted as saying that it was now too late for unionist unity, i.e., you know, the kind of perhaps the agglomeration of unionist parties into a single party to have any effect in terms of the kind of constitutional outcome, because, you know, the numbers have changed. The Good Friday Agreement offered, I think you described as the last best hope for unionists, and they failed to build on it. Is it too late, really, for unionism to reverse the decline that it's in at the moment, or could there be a rally to it? I mean, I suppose that's the calculation.
Well, I sometimes joke that I'm the son of a Presbyterian minister, not the son of a prophet. So I don't know what the future holds. I have to say, on the basis of both the evidence of the past and the way that they have conducted things, and the evidence of the present, I first of all see no real likelihood of unionism coming together. I mean, you've just seen over the last few months a further fracturing, not just between the DUP and the Ulster Unionists and the TUV, but within the DUP fracturing. I mean, I notice it here between some of the members in the Lords and some of the members in the Commons and so on. So I see no evidence they come together. And I think in that sense, it's hard to see how the trajectory can be reversed. I think what can happen is if people who do want to see United Ireland just hope or believe that it's going to fall into their lap and that they don't even need to do anything because these guys have lost and history is going in their direction. I think that would be unwise, because I don't think it's just Unionists in the north they need to persuade. I think there's a lot of people in the south that they need to persuade, because I think there's a lot of people in the south who say, you know, it took us a long time to get away from a civil war and its consequences, and we don't want to have a whole bunch of people coming in who don't really want to be here, and it'll not be a civil war, but it'll be a degree of kind of difficulty and unpleasantness, and really we can't be bothered with all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on what the offer is. Yeah. And a lot of engagement with people who might not be traditionally pro-United Ireland at all, might be quite against it. But there's quite a lot of people in the south that need to be engaged with too in the development of this. And some of it's socio-economic propositions, and some of them are cultural propositions. You know, what's the offer in cultural terms? I think one of the really important things there is the relationship with Scotland, not the relationship with England. Most Northern Protestants are not particularly enamoured of the relationship with English people. And they will say far nastier things about English people. Ask Sammy Wilson, and he'll say nastier things about English people than most Sinn Féin people will. But Scotland, that's a different story, because that's actually a relationship that goes back long before England was England. There was that relationship, the Kingdom of Dalriada, the Cross Straits. And I think understanding that and engaging with that, it seems to me, is really very important. Not because I necessarily think that Scotland is going to go independent. It may do, but it's a much more complicated thing for them, because if Northern Ireland becomes part of United Ireland, it automatically becomes part of the European Union. Scotland has to apply, changes of currency, all sorts of difficulties. So I think it's more complicated for them, and I don't know what will happen with regard to that. These things can sometimes build up and fall away. With Quebec, for example, it nearly got a vote for independence, and then when it didn't, it all fell back, and it hasn't really reappeared again. Maybe will at some stage. So I think that's how I would see it. People shouldn't just think, oh well, it's going to fall into our lap. I think they need to do a lot more relationship building than that.
I mean, recognizing that you're not a prophet, but still asking you to peer into your crystal ball. I mean, how would you kind of game out the various scenarios in terms of both Dublin and Westminster? We're likely to have general elections in both countries over the next 12 months or so. I mean, what impact will that have over the next 4 to 5 years? Because I mean, a lot of people are talking about, I mean, Sinn Féin in particular, talking about the kind of next decade being the kind of time horizon potentially for Irish unity, and that depends on various things. It depends on the outcome of a British general election and an Irish general election, and of course what goes on in the north, and the electoral performance in the north, through the assembly elections, next local elections, next Westminster elections, and all the rest of it. But I mean, from what we can divine at this stage, how do you see the next 4 to 5 years panning out?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that I actually think the practicalities on the ground in terms of relationships between North and South will be more important than the question of whether we're hanging on waiting for a border poll or referendum. I think that for example, business people, farmers, who begin to have to look to their supply lines and find that actually they can get their supplies much easier through the south from the rest of Europe, and indeed their sales as well as their supplies. I think that will have a go, which is why the Unionists were so upset about the border down the Irish Sea, because they know that there are potential consequences of that. I think there are lots of other kinds of developments, culture, sporting developments, and so on, which may be just as important as looking out for this opinion poll and that opinion poll. However, I mean, if it was the case, and I'm not sure it'll come quite as quickly as this, it may do, but will Sinn Féin get into government at the next election? Well, they very well could. They could get in as the largest party in government, but they might not, because there are, you know, very deep antagonisms in there between political parties in the South. You know, the South maybe is not as united as it would sometimes like to believe. So it might be the next election, it might be the one after. If it was the next election, of course, they would be able to say to their people, we are now in government in Ireland, North and South. And that, I think, would have a huge kind of consequence in morale terms. But even if they did, I mean, I think people can see a certain direction from. The other, in the North, in terms of the election, I mean, it's very likely that Labour are going to be the next government. It's a little bit more of a hill to climb than sometimes people imagine, for various reasons. Definitely. But I still think they're going to be in. If they needed a few votes, would my Liberal Democrat colleagues be prepared to go for that? Maybe. There's a lot of painful scars from the last coalition we were involved with, and although it would be much easier in many ways to be involved with Labour than the Conservatives, nevertheless, people have still some sore spots over that. But what I thought was really interesting was Keir Starmer's appointment of Hilary Benn as the Shadow Secretary of State, and he's not there as a placeholder. I'm quite convinced of that. I think he himself, Hilary Benn, I think he might not have been prepared to take any other shadow cabinet job, because he would have said, I've been there, I've done that, and so on. But this is important. This is potentially historically significant. And frankly, without casting any enormous aspersions, I mean, he would be the first serious heavyweight Secretary of State of Northern Ireland for quite a long time. I mean, most of the others are not of the same kind of caliber at all. You've got to go back some distance. Now, Keir Starmer puts somebody of that consequence in as Secretary of State. That tells me that he's expecting and wanting to have somebody there who can do whatever kind of serious business or heavy lifting is required. And I think you have a very thoughtful man, and I think, you know, all sides would be well to engage with Hilary Benn, not necessarily to persuade him of this or that, but to help him understand the consequences and complexities and nuance. Not many people from this side of the water understand the complexities and nuance. And I think I don't think he would claim to have a sense of them at the moment, but he is a very intelligent man, thoughtful man. And I think he's the kind of man who could come to understand those and be able to engage with them in a positive way. So that's one of the things that I look to as being quite important over the next few years in terms of the politics of the relations with Northern Ireland.
What would you, just very quickly, I mean, what would your advice to him be? I mean, we're obviously making several assumptions there that he does take up the role, but what would your advice to him be? Prepare for change, or what?
I think the first thing I would say to him is that all the significant developments that have taken place politically in my lifetime have taken place on the basis of serious collaboration between the British government and the Irish government. That has been the engine of change, whether it's the Anglo-Irish Agreement or the Good Friday Agreement or anything that has happened subsequently. That has been the real driver, and therefore I think you need to spend more time with the Irish government. There was 10 years when Strand 3 of the Good Friday Agreement was not operated at the highest level. British and Irish governments didn't meet, and then we had Brexit. So my first advice would be engage with the Irish government seriously, thoughtfully, build your relationships there. It's not just an intellectual question. Of course, listen to all the various people. Don't be seduced into spelling out too clearly exactly what is the basis on which you, if it happened in your time, would be making a decision about a border poll. Because if you do that, you're only going to wind up everybody to focus on that issue. Spend your time focusing on building relationships and helping other people to build relationships. The big failure of the Unionists was that the Good Friday Agreement reset gave them the opportunity to develop a whole new set of relationships with other people who were outside the Unionist family, and they failed to do it. That's a really important thing, is to develop the relationships. And I think that's what my advice to him would be. And to realize that many other things can contribute to the long-term healing of all of this outside the question of a vote yes or no. That's something that comes near the end of the issue. Because my sense of Sinn Féin, for example, and I've talked to some of them quite a lot about this, is that they do not want a border poll that comes out with 50% plus one. Of course, legally, it is 50% plus one, and that shouldn't be changed. That's reality, political and legal reality. But I don't think they want that. I think they want, when the border poll comes, that there will be a broad sense that this is the way that people want to go, and then we can build on it. And that's a big one. There's a big ask, that. But I think that they're right to not just go for scraping over the level that's required. I think you want to develop something. And I don't want to see something that divides people. I want to see something that together people can feel, let's do something together on this. And we shall see. It may be in 5 years, it may be in 10 years, it may be the next generation of Kevins and Johns that are talking about this. But as long as we do not have people being injured and killed in the meantime, that for me is the key thing. That's what I came into politics to do, was to stop people being killed by each other. After that, we can allow the relationships to develop and go wherever they go.
Kevin, I'm going to jump in. I think we've got two big questions left and then we're finished. But I do want to ask for a bit of clarification from your answer to Kevin, which was interesting there, about the potential of the Ben being the Secretary of State for the North of Ireland. Did I pick you up right that you were saying relationship, the important thing, you wouldn't basically obsess about the criteria or the clarification required for border poll? Now, this is the first moment I think I have alarm bells sounding. So let me run this by you, and then I'll give you the chance to clarify or stick by exactly what you said. So, I mean, I'm probably one of many people, I don't trust the British. And so that's a serious problem.
Very reasonable.
Yeah. So this lack of clarification about what the criteria is for a border poll, it scares me. That perfidious Albion further down the line will be allowed to pull all sorts of strokes, and they're really lacking accountability on this score. So what would you say to someone like me, a United Islander, and others who would be wanting a bit of clarity on this question?
What I would say is this. If you reflect back on what I said in the blog and what we talked about earlier on, your anxiety is based on the idea that they want to hold on to Northern Ireland. That's the last thing they want to do. They want to be rid of it. Yeah. The problem for them is how to do that. There is no way they could do that in the context of a campaign of terrorism. They couldn't. It's impossible. Their biggest problem now is how they persuade the Irish government to engage seriously on relieving them of the problem. It isn't you're absolutely right. One of the things that John Hume, when he was talking to the IRA, had to do was to convince them that the British were not desperately trying to hold on to Northern Ireland at all. And that's why you ultimately had the Secretary of State coming out saying that Britain had no longer, importantly, any selfish strategic or economic interest. Not there's no strategic or economic, there's no selfish strategic or economic interest. And British government had absolutely no problem saying that. The alarm bells that then went off were in the Unionist side, because they realised the writing was on the wall. But I don't think that people who want a united Ireland need to be worried about this question of the requirements and when a border poll will be called to go. I think the British government will do that as soon as they think that the thing is seriously deliverable, because Northern Ireland is a problem for them. There are really no major upsides. It's not like Scotland, where there's all sorts of defence questions where nuclear submarines are based and all this. There's none of that in Northern Ireland, and it's costly and to no great advantage now. And actually, there are all sorts of other interesting things if we went on to talk about defence issues and so on, where there is a lot of collaboration that goes on for the defence of the islands as a whole, that doesn't get talked about publicly, but it's there, and it doesn't require Northern Ireland to be within the United Kingdom whatsoever. Those things are about quiet intergovernmental and defence organisation collaboration with each other to protect the infrastructure of Ireland as a whole against other factors that would not be helpful to any of us.
John, I love that answer. That was a fascinating response to my question. So there's two questions left. Kevin, I'll ask John one, and you can ask him the very last one. So Kevin, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to go for the last question that we have down, and you can go for the second last question, Kevin. So John, I want to ask you about Naomi. A good woman, Naomi Long. I have a lot of time for her. She's a good operator. There's so many things that I like about her, respect about her. But this sitting on the fence on the constitutional question, I would have asked you this even before the research I did again from Liverpool University and John Tong, etc., about the membership. But when you talk about the election, which you wrote your blog on, and the numbers and the direction of travel and the trajectory, as you keep calling it, a lovely word, John, the trajectory towards unity seems to be the direction of travel. At what point does Naomi and her party have to get off the fence and call it on the constitutional question?
When they're given a serious offer. You know, the point where the question becomes meaningful is whenever those who want a united Ireland say, listen, this is what's on offer. And then, you know, she will either say yes or no, or more likely she will say, okay, let's sit down and have a conversation about that. Because you're saying this, but is that actually thought through? I mean, for example, Sinn Féin very often will send me documents, have done for many years, and they sent me an economy document a few years back, and I read through it and I thought, this is full of holes. This is not actually practical economic reality. And I sent it back to them with some comments. I said, look, I'm perfectly happy to get involved in a conversation about this. In fact, you know, I think conversations are a good thing. So my suspicion would be, or my expectation would be, that if an offer is made, it will then potentially trigger a conversation. But if there's no offer, she's not the one that's trying to promote a united Ireland. She doesn't, perfectly rightly, doesn't see it as her job to create that conversation. But I think one of the things that's interesting is that I get a sense that she has been more prepared to engage in conversations on these kinds of issues than what would have been the case, you know, a number of years back, 5 years, 10 years ago, because there is a developing conversation, and I don't think she's resistant to that. I think one thing that's important to realize about Naomi, apart from all the things you've said about her, you know, her being bright, tough lady, all of those kinds of things, and that is, she sees her job as a lands leader in a slightly different way from I saw mine, for a very good reason. I saw my job as trying to reach out to the two larger sections of the community and find ways in which I could engage, first of all, with each of them, and then they could engage with each other, and we could all engage together. So that was very much my kind of attitude, ethos, approach, and so on. I think Naomi feels, and I think she's probably right about that she is now the standard bearer for a third tradition in Northern Ireland that is not unionist, that is not nationalist, that is not fighting to stay in the UK or fighting for a united Ireland, but is pro-European, is addressing all of these other classic kind of liberal questions, and is increasingly young and future-looking. And I think she sees her job not so much, I don't mean she doesn't see it at all, but not so much as being there to bring two others together, but as being there to build up this center ground, or whatever you like to call it, this third strand or third, whatever. I think she sees her job as doing it. And therefore, you're able to be, you almost need to be, you know, tougher, more robust, more strident even, to winning people over to that perspective, rather than the kind of bringing people together to end the violence. It's not that that's not important for it. I mean, it is. She's the alliance leader. But I think it's a somewhat different agenda. And I think that's why she's there. I think the party saw that, and they looked at her and they said, she's the right one to take this by the scruff of the neck and develop this third strand of third community. And my goodness, they were right.
John, that is another brilliant answer, equally as brilliant as your previous one. Now, I've hogged up all my time. So, Kevin, I'm going to let you ask that second last question if you want, and anything else, Kevin. And after that, sort of wrap it up, and you get the last word, summing it all up, Kevin. So I want to say thank you to you, John, now, and then pass over to Kevin. Thanks a million, John.
You're
and
very
Kevin,
welcome.
Over to you,
I've
Kevin.
got two questions, if I can, for you, John. I mean, one will be obvious in a minute, but I mean, just following up on Kevin's point. I mean, you know, for John Alderdice, could you ever be in a situation where you would enthusiastically support Irish unity if and I'm sure you'll say there are certain caveats and an offer and all the rest of it, but I'd just be very interested in hearing what your thought process might be on that question. And the second one, I'll give you a fair warning of it, is the obvious one that sat there really. I mean, you're a trained psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and you know, politics is a very strange business. And it generates lots and lots of strange characters. And I'd just be very interested on your thoughts. With all due discretion, I'm sure you won't want to give a sort of psychological profile on individuals, but what are the lessons of 30, 40 years in public life taught you about the kind of psychology of politics and politicians? Because I think it would be fascinating to hear a kind of professional assessment. I think that would be very worthy. And it may reach beyond the confines of Northern Irish politics, and certainly with recent British prime ministers, I suspect there would be some very interesting remarks from people in your profession about their sort of state of mind at various points. So I'd be very interested just to hear your general reflections on a very long and very useful life in public life, but also as a psychiatrist looking on at this crazy business of politics.
Well, answering your first question first, I find myself in a slightly difficult situation because I now live in England, and I think it's not really for people like me. I don't think I will go back to live permanently in Northern Ireland or in the Republic or in a United Ireland. I mean, I think, you know, my kids, my grandchildren are all here. All the work that I do is here, and so I'm a little cautious about the idea that somebody like me should actually be voting on the future. It's not difficult for me to imagine that circumstances could change very dramatically, not just for me, but for lots of people from my kind of background. But they might not change. And so I think we have to wait. We have to engage with people. So I'm very cautious about giving a yes or no answer to that, because I think it could be unfair and it could be misleading, partly because of where I live now, and partly because you know, I'm being asked to say something about a situation which does not exist, and I'm wary about that. On the question of the psychology of politicians, one of the things that's been very interesting for me is the nexus between the psychology of individuals and the psychology of the large group. Many things that happen, for example, people getting involved in terrorism, when it is treated as a matter of simple criminality, you get the wrong answer. Because people who involve themselves in terrorism are generally not doing it for their own personal benefit. In fact, they're quite prepared to die for their cause. This is very different from ordinary criminality, where if you were doing something illegal, it would be for your own benefit, and if you died, that's the ultimate tragedy. But it's not the ultimate tragedy for somebody who's involved in politically motivated violence. The ultimate tragedy is the failure of her cause. So that led me to think a lot about the psychology of the large group rather than just the psychology of the individual. And the connection is this: when you ask about leaders, the leaders, for as long as they survive as leaders, almost inevitably, in their very personality, in their psychology, represent the psychology of the community that they live in and the community that they represent. So if you find somebody, for example, who is representing an angry, truculent community that feels betrayed, as many loyalists did, it's not surprising that they elect somebody like Ian Paisley, who in his very personality represents that kind of angry, confrontational, speaking about betrayal and so on and so on. Then, of course, you have those Unionists who have a sort of dependent relationship with Britain. You know, they want to be part of it. They know they're not really entirely part of it. They want to hold on to it. And they elected, for a period of time, Jim Molyneux, who was very much that kind of personality. You know, he He got into politics because he was the assistant to an MP. His relationship with Enoch Powell was very much that kind of deferential relationship. And although he was a leader of a larger party, when he was relating with Ian Paisley, you'd have thought he was the leader of the smaller party, because it was that sort of dependent kind of thing. My father used to say, unionists like that who talk about being master in their own house don't realize it's not a house at all, it's a lean-to. So there's that kind of stuff. If you look at the psychology of the sort of, if you like, moderate, it's not a very good word, Catholic Nationalist Party, the SDLP, you got somebody who was bright, intelligent, articulate, thoughtful, not fundamentally confrontational, but very clear in what he stood for and so on, which was John Hume. The personality of Gerry Adams is really a quite different kind of personality. Not the aggressive, the openly aggressive personality of an Ian Paisley, but a certain kind of passive aggressiveness about it, that he was not obviously out saying and doing horrible things, but back of the house, as it were, there was all sorts of stuff going on that had a very aggressive component to it. But it's not so much open aggression as passive aggression. So the point about that is, when people say, if only we had different leaders, we could sort the problem, it's a mistake, because the leaders are only there and only stay for as long as they represent the personality of the community as a whole. And when they no longer represent that, then they will either be put out or they will withdraw, and they will be replaced by somebody else. So, for example, when the Ulster Unionist Party became more angry and felt more betrayed, and so they elected David Trimble, who was a more robust character, but was also, a lawyer, somewhat of an intellectual, certainly an academic. So that the Ulster Unionist Party did not become like the DUP, where they're angry, shouting and all over, but they elected somebody who was able to represent that sense of betrayal and so on, but also, intelligent enough and middle class enough to represent where they stood. So that's an example of where, when the situation changed and the politics changed, a new leader with a personality that represented the personality of the community that elected them then comes to the fore. So, I mean, look, this is something I've worked out and thought about for a very long time and continue to think about. So it's not the subject for a 5-minute answer. It's a subject for a PhD. But but it's a very good question, Kevin, and I think it's a really important one. And I think it's not one that's maybe given as much attention as it deserves. So thank you for the question.
No, not at all. I mean, I suppose just finally, John, give us a flavour of what you're doing at the moment. Then you've been kind of out of the public eye a little bit for the last few years, but you've obviously been working on lots of other things. And just give us a flavour of what you're working on at the moment.
Sure. Well, one of the things was, what did we learn from the Northern Ireland or Irish peace process that was not just about our own history and background, but was about the human condition? Because if we did learn some things of that kind, which I think we did, then in principle, we could go to other situations of conflict and we could both understand them and try to help them understand themselves better. So I spent a lot of time doing that in Colombia, in Peru, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Balkans, in South Asia, visiting places, and of course, very particularly in the Middle East, going and meeting with people. In those days, going and meeting with Hamas and Hezbollah and Jewish settlers and all of these kinds of things. So I've been doing that quietly, just working away at that, and also writing articles, academic articles, book chapters, and so on about how we understand and explore those kinds of questions. I've obviously been doing some work here in the House of Lords on issues of human rights and foreign policy and so on, and I'm on the International Relations and Defence Select Committee of the House of Lords, so dealing with issues of international relations and defence at a time when we've got rather more wars than is comfortable for any of us. But I also set up some work at Oxford University because I felt that we had learnt some things and we needed to convey those to the next generation, and we needed to convey them to the kind of bright young potential leaders, not just of our own countries, but of other countries. And so I was invited to go to Oxford and set up a centre and work at developing work there, because you've young people there from all over the world, really bright young people who will be the business leaders and political leaders and thought leaders of their various different countries. And I spent a lot of time doing that. I currently run the Changing Character of War Centre, which was established just after 9/11, but I've been working at that for the last little while, which is taking in senior military people and journalists and others from various parts of the world for 3 months, 6 months, a year, for them to write papers, do research, write books, and so on. And I've also set up some other organizations myself working on these kinds of issues. And I was asked by a publishing house who read some of the papers and book chapters I'd written. They said, look, we really want you to write a book because the way you write, the way you think, the way you talk, we think it's important to try to convey that to other people, to other communities, to another generation. So please get down and do that before you pop your clogs. And so I have a contract at the moment to work with a publisher, and I'm supposed to produce the book for them by the beginning of next year. I have a feeling it'll slide a little bit, but I'm working away on that with 3 particular lenses that I'm exploring these questions of how my own thinking on conflict is developed. One is psychology, of course, and the second is politics, and the third is religious faith. Because all of these 3 things are things that are important to me, and they are lenses through which I have tried to explore and continue to try to explore these issues of human relationships at the level of large groups as well as at the level of individuals. And so that keeps me off the street corners.
That's fascinating. Oh, back over to you, Kevin.
Oh, John, that was brilliant, mate. And the whole faith thing is interesting. The third one you slotted in there. I don't know why. My father, God rest him, who's long passed away. I remember having the conversation literally about 20 years ago about you and about your Presbyterian faith and so on. And my father, who was now a devout Catholic himself, had an awful lot of respect for you. I don't know where he picked it up, but he started telling me quite a bit about your faith and so on and so forth. And it always stuck in my mind. So that's psychology, politics, religious faith. Oh, if I was young, I'd love to go and do a PhD up in Oxford under your tutelage. But look, getting back to the issue at hand, I think we got our money's worth from you there, John. So thank you very much. And what we'll do in a few days is we'll get that out to the public, and I hope the public respond and come back with the comments and thoughts and questions. And if they do, we'll make sure we pass them on to you, John. And can I just say to the public, there's a fella in the background pulling the levers here in Sticks called Harley that makes the whole podcast happen behind the scenes. So I just want to say a wee public thank you to Harley in the background, who people will never see. And John, thanks a million. Thank you for last week for speaking at our event in Westminster with John Finucane and Richard of Sinn Féin and Richard Thompson of the SNP and Kevin himself who was speaking. And thanks for tonight. Much, much appreciated, John. And hopefully let's stay in touch. And occasionally we might get you writing the odd article for irishborderpoll.com. And Kevin, can I pass over to you to say the final word?
Thanks very much, John. It's been illuminating tonight, and it gets us off to it in a good start. And you know, you're right, and lots of other people have been right. This is a conversation. It's a conversation is made up of participants who are prepared to speak and who are prepared to listen as well. And there's a lot that you've said there tonight, which we'll take away, but also I suspect a lot of the people that will listen to this podcast will take away as well, and think there's a lot to reflect on there as well as this conversation goes on over a period of years, taking us to eventually where we think we'll get to with this border poll. But there's a lot of issues to discuss, and you know, you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Kevins and also to Harley, and certainly by all means, let's stay in touch.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, John.
Bye.
Cheers, mate. Good luck.